Oh, welcome. Yeah, we got new voices now out of Join Me. It was like a shock. It's like, where's my old friend, you know? Anyway, so you all know who I am already. We can go through this quickly, and I think everybody at this point is experienced, so I don't need to give you a quiz on how to use the chat box. But it's kind of been a tradition. We always do a little quiz question because it's kind of fun. So here's your quiz question. I have a lot of fun, by the way, researching them. So here's your quiz question for this last session of ours. It's a question about Mississippi. And you've all done really well on the other one, so here's the question. So which of the following is not true about Mississippi? So the world's largest shrimp is on display at the Old Spanish Fort Museum in Pascagoula. And I apologize if I get any of the names wrong. I think I got that right, Pascagoula. Borden condensed milk was first canned in Liberty. Root beer was invented in Biloxi by Edward Alfred Bark, and Mississippi introduced the first Mardi Gras. So I think a number of you have answered already. Everybody want to take a shot at this? You are correct. So where does the first Mardi Gras get started? Anybody know? Where's it from? That's correct. It was Alabama, Mobile, Alabama. That's correct. A lot of people assume it was New Orleans, but that's actually true. Okay. Okay. No, it's not true. Mardi Gras did not start in New Orleans. It started in Mobile, Alabama. Okay. So that's just a little bit. Oh. All right. I have a lot of family in Louisiana. They might argue. They just say they did it better. And that certainly would be true. All right. By the way, if you ever get a chance to go to New Orleans, I absolutely recommend you go to Mardi Gras World. It's just fun to see how they build all the floats and the artistic stuff. But anyway, that's neither. They certainly do party better. Absolutely. All right, so let's get to our topic at hand. The topic is verbal judo, and verbal judo is kind of a cute title for what really is a conversation about assertive communications and de-escalating of situations and conflict situations. The name originated from a trainer who is actually working a lot with prisons and also working in law enforcement, and they kind of coined the phrase verbal judo. And just for those of you who don't know this about me, I don't think I ever shared this with you before, but in addition to doing staff development, I'm actually a martial arts master in Taekwondo. I'm a fourth-degree black belt in Taekwondo. So I consider myself a martial artist, and I'm always interested in some of the martial arts philosophy. So I thought I'd start with something that we talk about in my school, where I train with my Grand Master. And he tells the story of the empty cup. Okay, the empty cup story. And the story goes like this. A guy comes, by the way, I'll tell you one thing about martial arts. If you want, we do some kind of cool things, including breaking concrete, bricks and things like that, things you probably really shouldn't do, but we do. And a lot of people say, well, what's the trick to this? What's the secret, to martial arts? And the answer is there is no secret. It's just hard work. Okay, and what happens is sometimes people assume that they can just come and and get a quick secret. So the empty cup story goes like this: a person who's interested in having all of the knowledge of the martial arts, he comes to see this great and highly revered martial arts master. And he says, I'd like to learn all of this, but I've only got a day or so to learn. What can you do for me? So he sits him down and he hands him a cup that contains tea, and or an empty cup, actually. And he continues to fill the cup and fill the cup and fill the cup, and to the point where it overflows onto the guy's hand, and it actually burns him. I don't think he was severely burned, but it burns him. And so he goes, well, why did you do that? And he said, I did that because it's really important for you to understand this concept. When you begin to do martial arts, you must begin with an empty cup. because if your cup is already full, you can't add any more in it. And so the moment you say to me, I want to learn this quickly or instantly, you're telling me you have a full cup. You really need to have, and of course another way to rephrase an empty cup would be an open mind. But you need to have an open mind to possibilities. I can tell you as a martial artist, the most important thing for me is to trust my masters. I know they know more than I do, and when they ask me to do things I don't even think I can do, I trust they know better, and usually they do. Sometimes it's scary, but usually they do. So I think it's important to think about that concept of an open mind. So obviously we're looking at the issue of how we communicate with other people, because certainly verbal judo is about how we address communications issues. And one of the most interesting things that I have found as someone who's done a lot of training around assertive communications and verbal judo is how many times people will have a conversation with someone or start a conversation without really knowing what it is they want to accomplish. What is the objective they're looking for in that conversation? So a best example to kind of describe that would be, I'm upset with someone, they've done something that I didn't like, so I go and I talk to them about it. But when I'm talking about it, I'm really talking about how I feel. So I know how I feel, I'm not sure I really have gotten to the essence of what it is I want the person to do differently. So how many of you would say that's true for yourself? There have been a situation where someone's done something, and you really want to tell them, how you were feeling, but maybe you really hadn't thought about specifically what it is you want to ask them to do. So I want to just give you a very simple idea here. You really can only ask someone to do or not do something, and it has to be something they can understand. And that if you want to be successful, you want it to be something, hopefully, that they want to do. So sometimes beating someone up by letting them know how much you hurt them, they hurt you, isn't productive. Because when people feel bad, they want to avoid. And one of the ways that they can easily avoid is to blame you or bring up something you've done. Even when they know they're wrong, they'll bring up something you've done to just counter it. So I think it's really important to focus on what your goal is. Whenever I have a communication with someone, especially in work, I mean, admittedly in my own personal life, we're all not as good at this, but at work especially, I always make sure that before I meet with anyone, I think specifically about what I'm going to ask them to do or not to do. And I'll just give you a bit of advice. If I'm going to have a meeting with someone, and I always try to write that down, and if my hand is shaking so much because I'm so upset that I can't write it down, I don't have the encounter, because obviously I'm not in a right place. And that's another kind of martial arts concept, that is of being in a peaceful mind. You need to be in a peaceful mind and in a focused mind to be able to get focused results. So it's important to know what you want. How many of you would say you've had encounters with people and you were that upset that you really were, it would have been hard for you to write down what it is you wanted them to do? Anybody? So don't do it. Sometimes the best thing to do is to give it a little bit of time. So this stuff is not rocket science. I think a lot of us know the idea, but it's always good to have that kind of fresh reminder about these concepts. But I really would say, you got to break this down into kind of three things. You have to know what you want. You have to communicate it in the way that is likely to engender cooperation. And so a good example is, hey, idiot, help me, usually doesn't work. So in terms of communicating, I can tell you later we'll talk about assertive communications, but I always really try to provide as much opportunity for the person to save face if I can. So even though I know that what they did intentionally, I'll sometimes say things like, perhaps you didn't understand what I said, or perhaps you forgot. Anything that will allow them to save face, because making someone feel bad usually is not a good way to get them to want to cooperate with you. guilt really is not a good motivator. It works for some, seems to work for mothers, but it really isn't a good motivator at work. A much better one is to have the person want to do it. And, if you're, so we need to not oversell our case of why we were wrong. And, in fact, give the person every opportunity to kind of get off the hook a little bit, provided they're willing to change. How many of you would agree with that? And then along the same lines, and I'd said this already, I know I end up repeating a little bit, you really have to be in the right frame of mind to be able to have that conversation. And I say take your time. I mean, don't wait months, but just because something happens now doesn't mean it's always the best time to have a conversation about it. In fact, I generally try to give everything at least 2 hours, unless it's obviously a dire emergency, it's a safety issue, then I'm going to jump on it. And I do the same thing with emails. If I get an email that upsets me, I really try not to work on it even for at least, a couple of hours, because I might work on it and get so upset and hit send. By the way, emails do have their risks. Emails have their risks. For example, think about this. In the old days, if you wanted to jot off, an angry letter, first of all, it took you time to type it. Then you had to print it. Then you had to fold it and put it in an envelope. And then you had to put a stamp on it. Boy, that's a lot of time to realize maybe this isn't really what you want to say. So the instantaneous nature of emails also creates a bit of a risk. So, even if you're going to write it, make sure you don't send it right away. Always give it at least 2 hours before you read it. How many of you do that? I'm not talking about every email. I'm only talking about an email where, it was an upsetting email or an attack on you and you felt you needed to respond. How many of you tend to give it time? I know Megan said she did. Anybody else? So, if you have an issue that upsets you, I recommend, and you got to use a little diplomacy here. Sometimes it's hard to know what's the best approach. I usually like to set up a time to talk to somebody about a matter, and one of my favorite things to do, I actually don't like to do emails as much, because emails kind of create that document trail, but I will sometimes, purposely call the person when I know they're not around on a voicemail, like after hours, and say, I'd like to talk to you about something, a sensitive matter tomorrow, or, there's something I just need to review with you. So I let them know that way. Even if it's an email, I'll do a very, hey, how are you doing? You got any time tomorrow to talk? And I'll try to kind of request a time for us to meet. One thing that I always, by the way, and I just want to say this, a lot of the people who are very argumentative tend to be extroverted individuals, and they have the home court advantage. They'll make the confrontation with you. And what I often tell people is that sometimes the most power, by the way, let me frame it another way. How many of you have had a situation where somebody ambushed you and attacked you? And you probably, and you didn't answer it the way you would have liked to, and then you're kicking yourself an hour later because you could have had these great answers, okay? But you weren't just ready because you got caught off balance. How many of you have had that happen? Okay, so here's the first lesson. That when that happens and the person does that to you, what they're doing is they have the home court advantage. They've had all their time to plan what it is they were going to say to attack you, and now you're kind of caught blindsided and unprepared. So what I'll often do in situations like this, and this comes with a little experience, is I can tell when I've been ambushed, and I don't fall into the trap of automatically attending the argument I've been invited to. I'll say I'd love to discuss that with you, but this is kind of a hectic time. Can we meet a little bit later? And then at that point, I'm a little more prepared. Or in some cases, I'll say let's discuss it at another time. Get back to me with a time, and then they never do, because they were just loaded for bear at that moment. So I'll put it on their court. But I just bear in mind that whoever starts an argument always has the home court advantage if you had no idea that you were going to be having a discussion about that. So just bear in mind you don't necessarily have to do it when the person wants. You can choose your timing. One of the things I absolutely recommend in any of these encounters is that you use space to your advantage. And there are a lot of different ways you can look at this issue of space, but, it's within our culture, it's pretty customary to have, and by the way, you can try this. If we were doing this on site, I would actually show you. I sometimes will have people, when I'm doing this, on an on-site training, I'll ask two people to stand up, and I'll ask them to stand at what you think is a comfortable distance from each other for a conversation, and then I'll ask them to stand a little closer and ask them how they feel about that, and what are those distances. And traditionally within our culture, the distance is about, for informal business communication, is about arm's length. Okay, obviously we're hanging with friends, we might be a little bit closer, but it's at arm's length. And if somebody is in your space, you need to really clearly, tell them to back off or extend the space. And so watch out for being placed in corners or places where you can't step back. So one of my favorite things is to have a conversation with somebody. It's a stand-up conversation at the door frame of a desk, of an office, because that gives me a lot of room to be able to step back. But watch out for space. Also be aware of space with other people. So obviously when you have police and they're trying to interrogate, a witness, they try to actually invade their space. By the way, psychologically, people get very stressed out if they don't see an exit way out, like if there's any kind of a sense that the door is blocked. So the general advice is never appear to even be in the way of the door. And if you are in a confrontational situation, it's often better to not actually face the person directly, but more to the side. So what you'll see in a classic interrogation, police interrogation, is they do the opposite. They're trying to stress the person out. So they have one person absolutely in the face, and they have the other one appearing to block the door, the exit route. That's a perfect situation for an explosion. But they're hoping the person will explode so that they'll revere something. If you're dealing with students or an upset parent or an upset customer, you absolutely do not want to do any of those things. So any comments on space? Anybody have a thought on space? I know that was kind of an open-ended question. So those are just some of the physical dynamics. So let's get to some of the communications dynamics. So obviously, in most cases, the best type of communication is assertive. And I'm going to talk about what assertive is, but before I can do that, I really need to describe the other two styles of communication, which is hostile and passive. And so I'll start with those and why they're not a great idea in most cases. So let's talk about hostile communicators. So what hostile communicators are, and these are just some common characteristics, is they focus on the person rather than the attribute. So the classic example of that is, hey, idiot, help me. So I know that's a little silly, But the bottom line is, when we're really personal, when we're talking about the person rather than the behavior, then that would be hostile. And by the way, this is why this concept that I talked about in the beginning of being prepared is so important. If you don't know what you want, you're much more likely to be focusing on the person than on a particular thing you'd like changed. So I think that's just a helpful step. The second thing is over-dwelling on the past. So, the reason why I think a lot of communicators overdwell on the past is that they watch too much Law and Order. They think that when they're having an encounter with someone, they're treating them like a witness on the witness stand. Now, if you have a witness on the witness stand, who are you trying to influence, the person or the jury? I want to make sure you're alive. Person or jury? Or judge? Actually, if you have a witness on the witness stand, you're trying to influence either the jury or a judge. So you're trying to influence a third party. So if you're trying to influence a third party, then it makes sense to lay it on thick, okay? So if you want to convince everybody to kick someone off the island, then it makes sense to bring up something they did in the crib, their whole history. It tends to be counterproductive when you're dealing with the person, because by the time you've dealt with the second or third thing that happened, instead of thinking about what it is they've done, they're thinking about how they'd like to strangle you. So it's just not a productive endeavor. And here's why. What can a person not do about the past? They can't change it. So the way they experience it is we're hitting them, and they actually have only two possible reactions to that, and they're both counterproductive. They can either get angry or they can get depressed. If they get angry, then they often will lash back out at us. If they get depressed, people who are depressed or have a negative experience tend to avoid, and we may not get what we want. So I'm not saying that you should never bring up the past, but bring it up lightly. So let me give you a hypothetical. I know, Megan, you mentioned, I'm not sure this is exactly what you do, but you mentioned you work with students. So suppose that I were an instructor, and I needed to speak to a student that I was concerned about because he or she had missed a lot of classes. And obviously, to be successful, you got to show up. It is one of the requirements. Okay, so, and let's assume I wanted to address this. Okay, so I could turn around to a student, I could have a whole list, and I could say, you missed 5 times in September, 8 times in October, 12 times in November, okay? They do that, okay? You're the one that has to tell them that, right? Okay, so I'm just running the list. And it does not matter how unemotionally you do that. I would suggest to you that running a list like that is hostile. Because what happens is, by about the 5th item, the student just gets upset. So I'm not saying you can't mention the past. You have to give them a reason why you called. So what I might say is, I'm calling because we've noticed a pattern of excessive lateness, or of a pattern of missed classes. Now, at that point, if the student doesn't deny it, there's no point in running over each one of the dates. Do you understand what I mean? So what I say is you want to tread lightly over the past, so most of your focus is on what's going to happen for the future. And so I think that's really critical. So what I might say to somebody is, if we're an employee or a student, I've noticed, it seems that you've missed a lot of classes, and we're a little concerned about that. You want to share with me what's going on, anything we can do to help? So something like that. Now, if the student says to me, I'm never out, then obviously I'm going to have to provide more evidence. So I give a minimal amount, just enough to have a reason for the conversation, and then I mostly focus on what's going to happen as a next step. That's really critical, that distinguishes hostile from passive. So what I like to say is, hostile is about the past, assertive is about the future, okay? And this is about laying it on too thick. And there you go. I got the slide about that. So interestingly enough, a lot of hostile communicators are off message. Again, the person walks away remembering more the negative feelings they had than the thing we really even discussed. So it isn't necessarily a strong position. It actually makes you weaker. So hostile is not strong. It's actually weak. But it's an easy thing to get into. It's like we feel like we need to oversell our case. I would suggest the opposite. Whenever I look at an encounter, I ask, did I really end up getting drawn into the past? And I can have the person draw me into the past, too. By the way, I'll make an additional point about this. You know, I'm not a big fan of apologies. I don't consider them that important. How many of you like apologies? Everybody likes apologies. That's probably a terrible question to ask. I'm not a big fan of apologies, and here's why. Tell me if you agree with me on this. I know some people who apologize all over the place and then don't change. They just look at an apology to get as a way to get off the hook. A lot of children are that way. I'm sorry, whatever. Okay, and you get that with adults as well. They just apologize to get rid of, to placate you. And then you have some other people who, their ego just gets in the way. It's hard for them to apologize. So they have a difficult time with it. But they heard what you said, and they change in response to it. So you have to ask yourself this question: what do you really want? What would you prefer? Would you prefer someone who says sorry, 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 and then continues doing what they've always done? Or someone whose ego gets in the way, it's hard for them to apologize, but they heard what you said and they change? So which do you prefer, the apology or the change, assuming you can't get both? Anybody? What do you think? Right. So what I'm always focusing is on the change. If the apology comes, that's great. I don't push it, and I never force it. What I want is a commitment or agreement on the change. Because remember, again, an apology is about the past. It's about what was already done. And in some cases, even when the person apologizes, they say, no big deal, maybe you didn't really understand about this. I allow them to save face, but I want that commitment for the future change. So from this point on, let's agree to this. And the person says yes, I have to act as if I believe them, even though I may not, So that's a big difference. What the hostile person tends to do is lay it on thick and then be suspicious of whether you're really going to change. So in all of these encounters, it's always best to talk less and listen more. And that's sometimes hard for some folks. It's kind of hard for me. I'm a big talker, so I have to really work at that. At really giving the person an opportunity to do the talking and for me to listen and to respond strategically. Just something else to bear in mind, people tend to be in a talking or a listening mode. And I bring that up in situations, for example, where a customer is going, or a customer or someone I'm working with is coming to me and they're upset. And they're saying things that are incorrect. They're making false challenges. And I'm trying to correct them. I'm saying, no, that's not correct. I would suggest you don't do that. Because at that moment, they're in a talking mode. And I'll ask all of you this question. How many of you, when you had to call a company or an organization because you had an issue, practiced or rehearsed what you were going to say before you dialed the phone? How many of you have done that? You kind of rehearsed it mentally. So I would like to suggest that that's almost like an urge you have to get out. Until you really get that out, your ears are closed. So whenever I'm dealing with someone, especially if they're upset, what I do is I let them wind down. I'm not saying I won't respond, but I wait until they finish first. And by the way, what I do on the phone, it's interesting, is, by the way, I'd absolutely prefer to deal with people on the phone than in person, because I don't have to worry about controlling my body language as much. So yeah, which is a good reason why it's best to call them back. Because if you don't call them back, there's a very good chance they're going to show up, and that's a harder job. So yeah, I always try to cut it off at the pass by calling, okay? And when that happens, I let them do the talking. In fact, what I'll do is usually when a person is upset, they talk at a louder volume. So I'll just pull the phone slightly away from my ear. And when I can no longer hear them, that's only when I start to respond. Because remember, you're the fuel that drives this. And if you let them wind down, then they're now ready to hear your side, So I always try to do that first. And we already talked about this, how important it is for you to be in your own frame. Because when people are upset, and they're calling you, they're going to often say things that are inaccurate, unfair, hurtful, and if you're not in a good place to be able to let's put it this way, I work with a lot of folks on customer service, dealing with upset and angry people, stuff like that, and I can teach people every technique, all these best practice techniques, but if you're not in the best frame of mind, you're not going to do them. Your own emotions are going to run away from you, and it's not going to work. So I think it's really important to think about where you are, and I think about that a lot even when I have to call someone back. I don't always have that control when they call me, but even in those cases, sometimes what I'll do is say, look, I need to really look into this. Let me do some research and get back to you. Even though I have the information in front of me, it's not really that I don't have the information, it's that I need to refocus my mind a little bit. So that was hostile. Now let's talk about passive communicators. By the way, anybody here think that maybe they lean a little to the hostile side, if you're willing to admit it in a public forum? Anybody? You don't have to answer if you don't want. Okay. So now we're going to look at the other side of the coin. By the way, I probably should have said this before. I always like to think of this, I say a good way to think about this whole idea, I had that slide up before, was, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. That, remember the 3 bowls of porridge? One bowl was too hot, one was too cold, one was just right. So assertive is that just right. So we went over what too hot is. Now let's talk about, what too cold is, okay? And why there are problems with that. So the problem with, let's talk about what passive communicators are like. Passive communicators see things and upset them, but they don't say anything. They don't say a word. But just because you're not saying anything doesn't mean it doesn't upset you. In fact, every time you see the same thing, you just lose a little bit more enamel off your teeth, but you don't say a word. And so as a result of not saying a word, 2 things happen. Okay? One is that you can harbor rage from unresolved issues. It's really interesting. There is no guarantee when you communicate with someone that they're going to do what you want. I mean, you may not get what you want. It's not magic, but somehow people can let it go. Once they've stuck up for themselves, they can just let it go. However, when you don't address it, it kind of festers in you. So I'm not so much interested in what reaction this is for the other person. This is about how to help you. And if you're harboring rage, that can be problematic. The second problem with passive people is that they get the short end of the stick in life. So let me just give you a very simple hypothetical about this, okay? So you go to a store, and I'm not saying that all of you would be passive about this. I'm just using this as an example. But you go to the store and you order something, and you're going to pick it up. And when you go to pick it up, it's the wrong color. It's not the right color. It's not what you ordered, okay? Well, at that point, you have 2 choices. You can either what? You can either say, excuse me, this is the wrong color, I don't want it, or you can accept it. You can take it, okay? Now, if you complain, there's no guarantee that people will fix it. There's no guarantee. Obviously, if it's a well-run store, they're gonna try to make it right for you. But there's not a guarantee that everybody makes everything's right. But one thing's for sure: if you never speak up, you're guaranteed that you're gonna get the wrong thing. In fact, what I often say is, what speaking up really lets you do is separate the chaff from the wheat, because people can't read your mind. And they may do things that upset you. If you don't tell them, you tell them, they may not care. But if you don't tell them, they certainly won't know. So you can really determine, once you've told someone it concerns you, if they still don't care, they really are lousy. So this is kind of, so you tend to have, when this has a cumulative effect. I mean, if you're perpetually not sticking up for yourself, then you're getting the wrong food at restaurants, the wrong change, the wrong color on things. You're not getting the supplies you need at work. And so you're generally looking at the world as a place that's doing you in because everything's going wrong, and you have a negative view of everyone. Okay? So I'll just give you a personal experience with this, just kind of drive home the point. So, I stay in hotels a lot, although with doing more online training, I'm doing it less. But I used to travel a lot for business, more than I do now. And I went to a hotel. I was flying into Cleveland, and I stayed in a hotel. I got in late, you know how air travel is. And I went into my room, and the heat was not working. Okay? And so at that point, I had two choices. I could have either hunkered down, or I could have called down to the desk. Now, I didn't want them to really fix the heat at that point of night anyway. But I had a choice what to do. Okay, so in this particular case, I chose to call them and say the heat's not working. So what they did is they helped me out. They got some staff to come and help moved me to another room. They upgraded my room, and in the morning they told me the room's on us. So when I tell you this story about this hotel, what do you think of the hotel? You think that's a good hotel? What do you think? I would say yes, right? And I probably want to go there again, right? Think about what would have happened if I hadn't said anything. What would have been my view of the hotel if I had not spoken up? My view of the hotel would have been it's not a good hotel. That's correct. So now it's possible that I could have made the complaint and they could have told me, sorry, nothing we can do for you, in which case I would know they were no good. But look at how my decision to speak up had such a different, would have had such a different influence on my view of that hotel, okay? It would have had a totally different view. So what I'm saying is you really can't tell if people are bad at something until you've really spoken up and given them the chance to correct it. Because think about how many things can happen. Things can break any time. There can be miscommunication, confusion. So until I give people a chance to make it right, there's no way if I can tell. And that's true in our personal lives as well. If I have somebody, a friend, and they've done something that I feel has wronged me, and I don't at least let them know, I'm being unfair to them. I'm not providing them with an opportunity to make it right. Now, if I tell them about it and they don't care and don't do anything about it, then I know they don't care. So I think it's just important that passive communicators tend to have a negative view of life and negative view of circumstances because they never speak up for themselves. And while there's no guarantee when you speak up, you're surely never going to get what you want when you don't. Now, I know why passive communicators are passive. By the way, it isn't necessarily that they're quiet. Passive communicators are not necessarily quiet, they're non-confrontational. So when someone has a problem, they'll tell everybody else about it. So if I have a problem with one person, I'll tell this person, this person, this person. I won't tell that person. So it's not necessarily quiet. In fact, many of our chronic complainers are passive individuals who can't let it go because they never take it up with the person they have an issue with. This is the kind of person that'll sit in a staff meeting and the boss will say, any concerns about this? They'll say nothing, and then later on they'll complain about it behind the scenes. How many of you know people like that? They won't go to the person they have an issue with. They go to everybody else. So I understand why people are that way. They're afraid of pushback. And I understand it, but what I'm saying is it affects the quality of your life, and it's something worth working on. I understand that it's not easy for people, and I know that if you're a passive person, probably the first time you do this, you're going to go gulp. So I had one person, it's funny, I was doing a training, she said, I'm going to do it when I'm on vacation. So I won't be with anybody I know. So, but usually you come out the other side a better person. And, it is one of those things that people tend to get better with age. You kind of get a little more comfortable in your own skin as you get a little older. And so they get a little bit more confident, and it's a little harder for some people when they're younger. I'm not saying there aren't assertive young people, but it is a little bit harder. One more other piece besides harboring rage is an interesting characteristic that I call the straw that broke the camel's back. So you see, if someone has all this rage, it's got to go somewhere. So I'll have a situation where people, and I know I'm going to pick something trivial here as an example, but let's say that it really annoys me because people just keep borrowing pens and pencils off my desk, and they never return them. They say they're going to return them, but they never return them, okay? And every time someone takes one and they don't return it, or they just take one, I just get a little bit more annoyed, okay? And then all of a sudden, I get a day, it's hotter than usual, or I'm tireder than usual, or I'm just under a lot of pressure, and all of a sudden somebody comes and asks for a pen or pencil. They may not even have been the worst abuser. They just happen to be that unfortunate person who, came across the threshold at the wrong time, and I go from passive to being explosive. I turn from passive to extremely hostile, and I explode on them. Okay? So I have a term for this. I call it the straw that broke the camel's back. It's kind of like calm, 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 boom. I've had bosses like that occasionally. So one of the questions I often ask is, which communicator blows hot and cold? A hostile communicator or a passive communicator? Which one? Anybody? Correct. It's the passive communicators. I mean, the hostiles tend to blow hot, but, eventually you just get leathered with it. You get used to it. That's who they are. It's the passive ones that all of a sudden you think they're fine, and then they go explosive. And so it really creates, especially if you have a supervisor like this, really causes confusion on the part of the employees. And even confusion on the part of friends. Because here you were, you never said a word about this, I thought you were fine, and all of a sudden today I get like nuclear bomb, And then I don't know what's going on. Is it something doing with your life? Have you always felt this way? So it's just another problematic aspect of passive communications, that you're allowing things to build up. You can turn little things into big things if you don't address them, because they don't necessarily go away just because you don't address them. How many of you would agree? So now we go to what is assertive. So it's a simple idea, okay? So it has really three elements. One, it's detached and unemotional. And that is why the planning is so critical to assertive communications, because there's no way you can be detached and unemotional if you're not really clear and focused on what you want. Second, and this is along the same lines, it's results-oriented. And third, it's focused on the future. It's not about the past, it's about the future, because that's the only thing we can control, is the future. So, here is a example. I don't know if I put this in. I forgot what my slides are, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. So here's an example of what I would consider the perfect assertive statement. In the future, I'd appreciate it if. and then fill in the blank. So that would be an example of an assertive statement. And even if I wanted to be a little bit more emphatic about it, I could say in the future, like with an employee, in the future I expect that. That's still an assertive statement, okay? Now, you don't have to say in the future. You can say from now on, next time, but I think it's important to emphasize in the sentence that you're really focusing on next steps, on what's going to happen from this point on, not about what happened in the past. So, again, this is kind of just a list of things related, but, keep your feelings out, don't blame, ask questions to obtain understanding, listen, work from agreement. This is something, again, if we go into a little bit more details, and we do ultimately do a topic on negotiations, one of the things that I've learned in negotiations is I don't start with the hardest things. I try to build a foundation, a base of what we agree on. So even though we may disagree on many things, we may have some agreement on some things. So I want to build on strengths. So I start with what we agree on. So I've got the person now nodding, and then I see what we can do to maybe focus on clarifying some additional agreements. I don't jump right into the hardest or worst things. I build it up. So we talked about that already. Okay. Biggest challenge in any of these encounters is your own emotions and keeping them in check. And you have to bear in mind, I know I keep talking about peaceful mind, but you also have to figure that emotions are functioning for the other person. So this term, emotional hijacking, it actually comes from a book called Emotional Intelligence. The book was about a decade old. Prior to that, we had another name for this. We used to call it seeing red. But it's that point at which you're so upset, or the person is so upset, that the mind is not thinking well. And I've even had this encounters with employees, with coworkers, with students, where we were getting into a Mexican standoff. I was asking them to do it, and they were saying no, and the problem wasn't they were making decisions and actions that weren't even in their own best interest. They were just digging in because they were angry. And so what I often try to do is have a cooling off. If the person is that upset, I'll say, you know what, let's put a hold on this, and let's come back and revisit it in a couple of days, okay? And let's see if we can work it out. I had that. I just did training last week with some supervisors on how you do evaluations. And most employees get good evaluations, so not a lot of issues with that. But from time to time, you have to give an employee some bad news, and some employees accept it, and some get belligerent. And we were talking about what to do if we had an employee who was overly belligerent in a situation like that. And I recommended, at that point, the employee is just emotionally hijacked. So we're not in a rational place. So, I'll say, you know what, let's put a hold on this, come back and discuss it I'm not doing anything on it. You don't have to sign it today. Let's come back in 2 days, and we'll come and look at it again. Because it's amazing how often, after a couple of days, a night's sleep, a person's in a different place. I've had people that, for example, even at work, I've asked them to do something that's in their contract, and they have absolutely refused to do it. Ridiculous action on their part. And rather than overpress the point, I say, let's talk about it the next day. They go home, they talk to their family, everybody goes, what, are you out of your mind? And they come back to me the next day grudgingly saying they're willing to do it. So sometimes giving it time can really give a big benefit. You've got to be able to measure the temperature in the room when you're trying to do an encounter with a person. And once I'm convinced their temperature is too high, then I gotta create what I call a cooling off. How many of you would agree with that? So, what happens if they attack you? This is always the tough stuff. What happens if they attack you? Okay, so here's an example. Someone, and there are so many examples, but it's good. It's good to have a few. I'll give you a few cues of things. Have you ever had a situation where someone said, "I'm really insulted by what you said"? Has anybody ever? And they may not have used those exact words, but they implied they were insulted or that you hurt their feelings by what you were saying. Anybody? Okay, so I want to just give you, we were going to record it, Pamela, anyway, okay? So, Karen, no one's ever done that? Woo, what a life you've lived. Anyway, okay. So, but I have occasionally had people, even in a work situation, say to me, I'm really insulted by by what you said. You hurt my feelings. And what I always do is the following. I kind of stick it to them. Okay? And so the way I stick it to them is I say, well, it was certainly not my intention to hurt your feelings. Can you tell me a way I could have shared that with you that would not have hurt your feelings? Help me to understand how I could have done that in a way that would not have hurt your feelings. And the reason why, so that's called interrogatory assertive. That's where you turn it on them. And I'll just repeat it again. So what I would say is, if they're accusing me of, say, hurting the feelings, say, that was not my intention, can you share with me how I could have communicated that to you in a way that would have not hurt your feelings? Normally the person goes completely silent on you, because the truth is it was not how you said it. It was the information you were sharing, and there was no way you could have done it. They just didn't like what you were telling them. But I think it forces them not to be able to use that as a weapon. So watch out for that. That's always my standard response. Someone says you hurt my feelings, that was very insulting. I say it was definitely not my intention to do that, and I apologize if you felt that way. Tell me how I could have done it another way in the future, how I could have handled that differently that would have made you feel better about it. So one of the keys with all of this, and we'll wrap up soon, is, how do you redirect energy? Don't always take a direct. One of the things that I learned as a martial artist is, if someone's going to throw a punch at you, don't stand there and take it. A lot of what we try to do is deflect energy, use the person's own energy against them in a lot of cases. And I think, again, some areas of where you can redirect energy is if I'm in a conversation with someone, they want to make it about me and they want to talk about other issues or how they're upset on the job, I'll be glad to do that. Or here's another example of a way that I use redirecting energy. I will come to a person and I will say, it's come to my attention that something's happened. Tell me if this has ever happened to you. So maybe you have to share something when you say, it's come to my attention something's happened, and they say, who told you? Have anybody ever heard that? They say, who told you? They want to know what was the source. Yes? No? So I have a great answer for that. So I say, well, is it true? That's my answer. Is it true? So that completely turns it around. I've redirected the energy. The energy was towards me being on the defensive in trying to describe where I got it from to, is it true? Now, if you feel that's a little too confrontational, you could certainly say, well, I'd like to hear what happened from your perspective. And what they usually do is pretty much admit they did it, but they have an explanation for why they did it. Well, I didn't start, or, everybody does it, or something to that effect. But that's an example of redirecting energy. I redirected from the source of where did I get the information from to really turning it around so the person has to really explain what happened from their perspective. Because remember, the whole point of bringing it up is really to have the conversation with them. In a lot of cases, especially if things have consequences, I'm always trying to reduce fear and anxiety. So, for example, if I'm dealing with an upset customer, I'm dealing with an upset parent, even an upset student, the first thing I want to do is make them feel calmer. So I'm not trying to raise anxiety. I may say something like, look, I have a small matter I need to, don't worry about it. They look all nervous and anxious. I want to make them feel calmer because I know that anxiety is going to get in the way of us being able to seek an agreement. So again, it's another type of taking the temperature. Not all temperature is about emotional hijacking in anger. It also could be a kind of emotional hijacking that comes from fear or anxiety. And I don't want an anxious person. I want a calmer person, And that's why I take my time. Sometimes I'll say, can I get you a cup of coffee? How's the weather? Before we actually get into the matter, And this, again, I went over. I wasn't sure if this slide is in there. But always important to focus on what you're going to do in the future. And clarify agreements. I think it's really important sometimes to summarize, One thing I used to do when I would meet with parents, I would write down a list. I'd say I want to write down what I'm going to do, because obviously we're going to work on this challenge with a student. I'm going to write down what I'm going to do, and then what I'll end up in the end is what I'm going to do and what you agree to do, and then we'll share a copy of it. So we're kind of making an informal agreement. But I think it's always important to confirm expectations. Confirm. Especially if there's steps you need to undertake. If people are anxious and you need to represent your organization, for example, someone is calling up, they're very upset about a situation involving themselves, and you don't have the power, you have to do some research, or it's something that has to be handled by your boss. Always important to express confidence in the organization, confidence in the boss. Saying things like, we'll do our best, in most cases we can work problems out. Let's see what we can do. So you don't want to raise anxiety, you want to lower it. So let me stop. Any questions any of you might have before we wrap up? We're actually over on time, but anything? Comment, political statement. I know this is our last session. I'm going to miss you guys. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope some of you are still there. Okay. All right. So there is no, will everyone cooperate? So, Norma, you mean what happens if you've contacted an organization and they haven't responded to you? So you're on the other end of this, okay? I will tell you it's getting harder and harder. I will tell you, with big corporations, it's getting harder and harder for us to make contact with anyone. They barely will let you speak to a human. But I have heard from some friends, in some cases, that actually a letter sent to a CEO can go a long way. So if you're really running into a frustrating situation and you're not getting any service, write a letter to the head of the organization. Now, it's not, in most cases, it's not the CEO that's going to handle it. It's going to be their office staff. But oftentimes when they make a contact, especially if it's a legitimate, have a legitimate issue, when they contact that other division and the inquiries coming from the CEO, it shakes the trees. And I have found that to work effectively. No magic formulas, but that's kind of, and I certainly don't want to do it over a trivial matter, but if I really reached a brick wall or an impasse, and I'm just feeling like no one's responding, I go right to the top. And I believe that in a university, going right to the top, too, would be a good idea. But again, you can't be like the boy that cried wolf. If you're going to run every time, eventually you're going to get ignored. So you have to kind of be careful, but I think that's helpful. I'm not sure what you meant about it the other way. You want to add any additional details so I can figure out how to possibly respond to your question? Did you find that helpful? So I'm just going to kind of, oh, you mean about the confidence? So what I would say on confidence is, let's say someone, well, let me just give you one example of this. Because the best ones I've ever heard on this are coming from people in the field. So I was talking about the use of confidence statements on the part of staff who have to support like bosses, right? And this one secretary who worked in a special ed department in the schools told me this thing that she said that I thought was about the coolest confidence statement I'd ever heard, okay? So here's what she said. She said, I've been working in this business for 20 years, and I have never had an opportunity to work with a more thoughtful and caring team of professionals. If there's a solution, they will find it. Now, that's not necessarily an absolute promise. I'm not guaranteeing that person anything. I'm not making commitment to anything specific. But the fact that I'm expressing so much confidence in my team, that tends to make the person feel more confident, and that gives us time. That's the kind of statement that might prevent the person from immediately wanting to run to the, up the chain, and might give you a few days to get back to them. So that would be an example of, using a confidence statement. Let me just end on one thing. Communications is not magic. You can say things in all the right ways, and the person can simply not want to please you. So what I like to say is what communication does is it allows you to separate the chaff from the wheat. And to go back to my example with the hotel, telling the hotel that my heat was not working was not a guarantee that I was going to get that fixed. But what it did do is allow me to distinguish between those who wanted to make it right and those who didn't. So when you speak up, and in an assertive way, you're able to distinguish the people that want to please you from those who don't. And if you don't speak up, then you're expecting people to read your mind. And that is often what passive individuals do. They'll say things like, he should know how I feel, she should know how I feel, and the answer is in most cases they don't. Maybe they could if people were more in tune, but most of us are busy living our lives, and we're not necessarily hooked into the emotional state of everyone around us. So if you want something, you got to ask for it. Like I said, no guarantees, but higher probability when you ask than when you don't. And on that note, I guess we should wrap up because many of us have other things to do. I want to thank you again, and as always, the recording will be available shortly. And we'll be back to you with topics for next year. If any of you have any suggestions, you can forward them out to Jennifer, and whatever the powers that be that make this choice will certainly be taking your input. So thanks again.